In today's video, I'll be ranking every gang and faction in Red Dead Redemption 2. And before we start, hold this in the back of your mind, because the answer doesn't come until near the end. Which faction in Red Dead Redemption 2 is more dangerous than every single outlaw gang combined? The Van der Linde gang. The founding story is almost too perfect. Two petty hustlers cross paths at a campfire on the road to Chicago sometime in the mid-1870s. Hosea Matthews tries to con and rob Dutch van der Linde. Dutch had already done the same to him first. They both started laughing because they'd recognized themselves in each other, and that recognition became the origin of everything. From that moment, Dutch built something, a philosophy. He recruited from the margins, from the forgotten. Arthur Morgan, taken in at 14 after losing both parents, became Dutch's first protege and eventually his most dedicated enforcer. John Marston and Abigail Roberts, two people the world had already written off. Charles Smith, Sadie Adler, Sean McGuire, Javier Escuella, Hoseas himself. People Dutch found broken or running or both and brought into something that looked, from a certain distance, like a family. Dutch's stated vision was freedom. Freedom from a society being strangled by industrialization, corporate greed, and a government that served the wealthy rather than the people. For years, that framing made the Van der Linde gang feel like the closest thing the dying West had to outlaws with an actual purpose. Then you start paying attention to Arthur. Arthur Morgan doesn't say much about what he notices, but he notices everything. He knows that Dutch's moral flexibility has been expanding quietly and consistently. He knows that each decision Dutch makes in a crisis gets a little worse, a little more rationalized, until the ideology becomes indistinguishable from self-preservation dressed in better language. He knows the difference between a man who leads and a man who performs leadership until the performance is the only thing left. Here's why the Van der Linde gang ranks lowest on the evil scale, despite having one of the highest body counts on this entire list. Their violence is reactive, not predatory. They don't ride into towns for sport. They steal to survive. They kill to protect their own or to escape people already trying to kill them. And more importantly, for most of the gang's history, there is a moral code, imperfect and fraying by the time the story begins, but genuine in its origins. Walk through the camp in the early chapters. There is a man who hesitates before pulling a trigger, and sometimes doesn't pull it at all. A woman who spent the first chapters thinking about her son's schooling. A man who still removes his hat in churches. These details are not accidents. Rockstar put them there deliberately. What corrupts the Van der Linde gang isn't weakness. It's Micah Bell, and what Micah Bell reveals about Dutch. Rockstar designed Micah to be irredeemable, the devil on Dutch's shoulder, the embodiment of selfishness and corruption, and Dutch increasingly listens to him and calls it strategy. By the time the credits roll, almost everyone in that camp is dead. The dream of freedom has produced exactly the kind of ruin it claimed to oppose. The weight of that collapse is the whole game. Now sit with this. If the Van der Linde gang ranks lowest because their violence was reactive, what does the faction directly above them look like? The answer: a mirror image of Dutch's gang, with everything human removed. The O'Driscoll boys. Decades before the story begins, the O'Driscolls and the Van der Linde gang were actually allies. Then relations soured, fast and bloody, and without any clean explanation surviving in the historical record of the game. Colm O'Driscoll prefers quantity over quality. His gang is enormous and his men are expendable. He doesn't build loyalty the way Dutch at least pretends to. He accumulates numbers. When those numbers dwindle, and they always do, he recruits more. The O'Driscolls are the first major antagonist faction you encounter, appearing most heavily across western and central New Hanover, and they function throughout most of the main story as the default violent opposition. But here's what puts them above the Van der Linde gang on any honest ranking. When Kieran Duffy, a former O'Driscoll who had defected to Arthur's camp, who had spent chapters being more of a frightened hostage than a real member of anything, is eventually recaptured by his old crew, they send him back to Dutch. They send back his head. That's not a tactical decision, that's a message. The O'Driscolls decapitate deserters because Colm treats loyalty as binary and punishment as performance. These are also the men responsible for what happened at the Adler homestead. The game doesn't describe everything that occurred before they burned it down, and it doesn't need to. What the O'Driscolls did turned a quiet woman living peaceably on a ranch into one of the most dangerous people in the West. Sadie Adler is built entirely from grief and rage they created. Colm's eventual execution, publicly by the law, is one of the most satisfying moments in the story. After it, the O'Driscoll boys slowly fall apart. Their final stronghold gets dismantled in a mission that feels earned. And unlike every other major faction in the compendium, the O'Driscolls cannot be encountered at all in the epilogue. When they die completely. But ruthlessness is at least readable. You can predict a man who wants money and revenge. What comes next fought with conviction, and conviction in the wrong hands is more dangerous than anything. The Lemoyne Raiders. The Civil War ended in 1865. The Lemoyne Raiders don't appear to know this. They are ex-Confederate soldiers and young men with deeply reactionary politics, riding through Lemoyne as though the South's defeat was a temporary setback rather than a historical verdict. Their territory centers on roads and the surrounding regions. Their targets are Northerners, politicians, anyone who represents the version of America they refuse to accept. They deal moonshine with the Braithwaite family. They terrorize locals through campaigns of organized intimidation that have been going on so long they've become part of the landscape. Their stated cause is independence. What that means, functionally, is the preservation of a social order built on slavery, and they lack either the self-awareness or the honesty to say so plainly. The Lemoyne Raiders claim they fight for freedom while their entire ideology is premised on denying it to everyone they've decided doesn't count. Walk into Shady Belle, their reclaimed plantation house in Scarlet Meadows, and you understand something that no dialogue scene spells out directly. They keep returning to this specific place, not because it's strategically optimal, because it's a plantation. They hold it like ownership means something, as if possessing enough of the right kind of real estate rewrites a history that already happened. There's a specific kind of dangerous delusion in a faction that fights a finished war. It doesn't respond to reason, it doesn't negotiate, just keeps riding further south, further back in time. By 1907, many raiders are drifting toward Texas. But they haven't disbanded. This ideology doesn't disappear, beer. It migrates and waits. If you've been watching this far, subscribe before we go further. The factions we haven't reached yet are operating on a different level of wrong entirely. The Raiders had ideology. What comes next has something scarier. No ideology at all, and no ceiling. The Del Lobo gang. The Del Lobos carry a grievance with genuine historical roots. They are a massive gang of Mexican outlaws, exiles, and opportunists whose resentment toward the U.S. government traces directly back to the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. Real dispossession, real displacement, real injustice buried in their origins. But what grew from that origin is harder to defend. The Del Lobo gang steals from greed, not survival. They kill for pleasure as much as for profit. They are a sprawling, persistent menace across New Austin, raiding towns, robbing trains, threatening a disease-weakened settlement to spring a captured member from jail. They have more hideouts than any other gang in the game. 4 confirmed locations across the map, with more in Red Dead Online, where they spread across all 5 states. Their geographic scale reflects their ambition. Their primary leaders across the relevant period are Alfredo Montez, executed without trial by Marshal Tom Davies in 1898, and his successor Esteban Cortez, captured or killed by John Marston in 1907. Esteban's brother Ramon, captured by Sadie Adler and John together, was presumably hanged shortly after. Here's the one genuinely admirable thing the Del Lobos ever do. When Ramon Cortez is imprisoned, a significant force of the gang risks everything to break him out. That kind of devotion means something. It's just not enough to offset what they do to everyone outside their circle. By 1911, the Del Lobos have vanished from New Austin entirely. Other gangs occupy their former hideouts. No one in the game explains what happened. They left a territory-shaped hole and nothing else behind. The Laramie gang, the Foreman brothers, and the margins of the map. Not every criminal faction in Red Dead Redemption 2 earns its own story arc. Some of them live at the edges, in epilogue missions, in side encounters, in the quiet corners of the map that the main narrative never reaches. But they fill out the picture of what this world actually was, and leaving them out would leave something important on the table. The Laramie gang, sometimes called the Laramie Corporation, arrives in the epilogue, taking over territory the O'Driscolls used to occupy. They are hired muscle for wealthy landowners pursuing aggressive expansion. Abel Atherton, who owns Hanging Dog Ranch, specifically contracts them to coerce David Gedges of Pronghorn Ranch into surrendering his property. The methods are intimidation, assault, and the murder of farmhands, all contracted, all business. There is something specifically modern about what the Laramie boys represent. They are not outlaws driven by ideology or desperation. They are a privatized violence service. The evil here is transactional rather than personal, which doesn't make it less evil. It makes it more reproducible, more scalable, more institutional. The Foreman brothers, led by Anthony Foreman, carry a direct connection to the Vanderlinde gang through Tilly Jackson, who fled the group after killing Anthony's cousin in what the game implies was clearly self-defense. Anthony tracks her down anyway and takes her hostage. Susan Grimshaw and Arthur get her back in a rescue mission that leaves Anthony with a very clear message about the consequences of pursuing this further. What separates Anthony Foreman from most of the men higher on this list is a single decision. After the rescue, he keeps his word. He walks away. He leaves Tilly alone. By 1907, the Foreman brothers have disbanded entirely. A man who can make that choice, honoring a word given under duress to people who just embarrassed him when the alternative would have cost him nothing, is not in the same category as what follows. Then there are the Watson's boys, who rob to get their elderly mother to a more comfortable situation. Their methods are wrong. Their cause is the closest thing to genuinely human on the entire list. At the very bottom of the evil ranking, barely criminal in any meaningful moral sense, the Anderson boys operated across Scarlet Meadows and kidnapped 3 wealthy individuals for ransom before before the game's events begin. Ike Skelding's boys leverage captured government bounties for financial gain on the fringes of legality. Small in scope, not small in harm, the Murfree Brood. Most of the factions on this list want something identifiable. Money, territory, revenge, survival, power. The ideology of a South that no longer exists. The Murfree Brood wants something harder to name. They inhabit Roanoke Ridge, and they have claimed that territory in a way that goes beyond normal gang control. Memsers are known for physical deformities resulting from generations of inbreeding. They rarely wear shirts. They don't negotiate. They don't threaten and wait for compliance. They don't announce their presence before violence happens. They appear from the tree line and then they are already on you. Their hideout, Beaver Hollow, announces exactly what it is before you ever reach the entrance. The outer approaches are marked with mangled corpses, arranged deliberately, not dumped carelessly, displayed. A warning system built from human remains. Inside, the cave system disorients even experienced players. Easy to get lost in, and the Brood favors shotguns and machetes because they want close quarters. They want to be close. The Brood's presence in Roanoke Ridge is severe enough that commerce and travel across the entire region are suppressed. Only major towns like Annesburg function with any normality. Everything smaller has been cowed into silence. The Vander Linde gang temporarily displaces the Murfrees from Beaver Hollow in Chapter 6. By 1907, the Brood has reclaimed it. You can end an individual encounter with the Murfrees. You cannot end them. There is no tragic backstory here, no injustice that created them, no identifiable moment that turned them into what they are. They are what happens when violence becomes generational tradition, when brutality is the only cultural inheritance passed from one decade to the next. But at least the Murfrees hold territory. They defend what's theirs. What comes next has no territory to defend. They move through the world like a question nobody asked. The Skinner Brothers. The Skinner Brothers are why you don't ride through tall trees at night. Unlike every other major gang in Red Dead Redemption 2, the Skinners have no primary hideout to attack. No camp you can locate and clear in a single decisive operation. No central location where you can end them. They ambush. They materialize in high numbers from tree lines and boulder clusters you weren't watching. They bring machete men. A single Skinner brother with a machete can drop you in one hit if you're not already in Deadeye. What the Skinners do to their victims is what sets them apart from even the Murfrees, who are savage and territorial, but at least operating within recognizable violence. The Skinner brothers scout. They dismember. They roast and flay victims alive. In random encounters throughout their territory, you'll find horses emerging riderless from the forests. Their riders dead with arrows through them. No survivors to tell you what happened. In many of these encounters, the violence appears to have been specific. Not chaotic killing, but something more ordered. Something that takes time. Something that suggests the process, not just the result, was the point. They've been called a nomadic cult rather than a traditional outlaw gang, and that framing fits better than anything else. A criminal organization operates on economic motivation. A cult operates on belief. The Skinner brothers appear to believe in what they do. What exactly they believe remains something the game never explains, and the game knows precisely when to stop explaining. Rockstar held them back deliberately. You won't encounter the Skinner brothers in earnest until Epilogue Part 2, where they become the antagonists in several required story missions. By then, the emotional weight of the main game has already landed. The player has processed everything, and into that rawness, Rockstar introduces a gang that operates entirely outside narrative logic. The Skinners exist to remind you that the Frontier's darkness had no floor. Hey, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching so far, and watch out for Part 2 of every gang and faction in Red Dead Redemption 2 Explained.